In this lecture, we discuss the history of federal policy regarding Native American religious and cultural practice. The United States had funded directly missionaries in Indian country as early as 1776, had insisted in some treaties that tribes welcome missionaries, and had appointed religious persons as Indian agents and educators for decades by the time President Ulysses S. Grant established the peace policy in 1869. Nevertheless, the peace policy represented so dramatic an increase in efforts to Christianize and to civilize American Indians, two terms often used interchangeably at the time, that it marked a significant change in federal Indian policy. While the peace policy itself barely lasted into the 1880s, it started a wave of intense efforts to convert and assimilate Native peoples that would last until the 1930s. Following the Civil War, Congress established a joint special commission to investigate the circumstances of Indian tribes and their treatment by federal and military officials. In its report of 1867, combined with a report of the Peace Commission the following year, provided the basis for President Grant's peace policy. Both reports emphasized the need to shift policy away from military subjugation and unjust treatment of tribal communities, and the Peace Commission report urged for expanded efforts to civilize them. The announcement of the peace policy in 1869 was an implicit acknowledgement that prior policies had not solved the Indian problem, particularly due to incompetent or corrupt implementation of those policies. The peace policy represented a formal, coordinated effort between the federal government and religious groups in a number of ways. First, Indian agents would be selected from primarily Protestant Christian groups in order to increase the likelihood of competent and moral implementation of the policy. That is, to curb rampant corruption and ensure religious leadership. In effect, the policy would allot tribal communities to specific Protestant groups, effectively creating captive audiences for their missionary work. Second, the broad aim of the policy would be to teach Indians the values of a Christian civilization and thus be prepared ultimately to assume the duties and privileges of citizenship. Such civilization included the benefits of private property, the Protestant work ethic, and sedentary agriculture. Reservation churches and schools would be the primary, though by no means the only instrument to achieve those broad aims. Third, federal funding for schooling and missionary work increased significantly. Fourth, Congress authorized the President to create the Board of Indian Commissioners, comprised of 10 men of intelligence and philanthropy, all of whom were appointed from Protestant groups. The board would oversee Indian affairs and financing, act as intermediary between the government and religious groups implementing the policy, and would track evidence of acculturation efforts. The Board of Indian Commissioners were appalled at the treatment of Native Americans and excoriated the rapacity of the white man and the sickening record of murder, outrage, robbery, and the wrongs on tribal borders. Their first annual report also laments official treatment of American Indians as unjust and iniquitous beyond the power of words to express. Seeing in Indians the capacity for work and religious conversion, the board urged that they be concentrated on reservations, treated as wards of the federal government, and educated through schools employing Christian teachers and on-reservation missions. Necessarily, such improvements would require abrogating Indians' rights and guiding them to civilization and Christianity. Non-Indians in the West generally favored much harsher treatment of Indians during the peace policy, and the policy came under broader criticism following interracial conflicts in the 1870s, particularly Custer's defeat in 1876. President Rutherford B. Hayes shifted the focus, emphasizing private property and federal law over Christianization efforts after 1877. The new and corrupt Indian Commissioner purged a number of religious Indian agents and was sufficiently hostile to their mission to cause withdrawal of some missionaries. The peace policy was finally ended in 1882 during President Chester A. Arthur's administration, and Congress relieved the Board of Indian Commissioners of its power. Although the peace policy and selection of Indian agents by religious groups ended, Christianity remained an integral component in both government-funded sectarian schools and government-run schools. In the 1880s, the government dramatically expanded the practice of contracting with mission schools. This continued until Protestant groups became so troubled by the increasing inclusion of Catholic schools that they began promoting separation of church and state. By the end of the century, government-funded sectarian schools were supplanted by government-run schools, which favored the Protestant tradition. Particularly in the Northern Plains, Catholic schools remained in large part funded through tribal trust income. Mandatory religious education continued in government-run schools, though it was described as non-denominational. Assimilation policy was not restricted to the provision of Christian education, but also to the destruction of Native American religions and cultures. In 1883, the Secretary of the Interior insisted that the courts of Indian offenses include what came to be known as the Indian Religious Code of Conduct. The Secretary regarded the continuation of the old heathenish practices, such as the sun dance and scalp dance, as a great hindrance to the civilization of the Indians. In his view, the dances promoted debauchery, diabolism, and savagery. As noted by Professor Stager Gooding, the list of Native American practices prohibited by these federal regulations suggests this policy was aimed not at the beliefs of Indian peoples, but at the networks of social and political relations produced in the context of indigenous ceremonial practices. Prohibited practices were established in 1883, 1892, and 1904. They included 1. All dances and any similar feast. 2. All plural or polygamous marriages and those not solemnized by an appointed judge. 3. All practices of medicine men and the prevention of Indian children from attending religious schools. 4. The destruction, injury, taking, or carrying away of any personal property without reference to its value, particularly in the case of the death of an Indian. 5. The exchange of gifts between families when negotiating marriages. 6. Intoxication. And 7. The failure to adopt habits of industry or to engage in civilized pursuits and employment. The regulations were enforced through fines, the withholding of annuities and food, and imprisonment, especially during harsh winters where tribes were confined to reservations and dependent on treaty-promised rations. The withholding of food was effective at stifling dances and achieving church attendance, as did the threat of military intervention. As an aside, the prevention of passing of wealth upon death and the sense that Indians would disappear through assimilation also allowed for the widespread expropriation of personal and cultural property for individual and museum collections. There was not universal agreement among Indian agents that ceremonial dances were religious rather than cultural and social, but the prevailing justification for banning them was stated in religious terms, criticizing them as rites, heathen, or pagan. They were also commonly criticized as inciting passions, both warlike and sexual. Moreover, because the dance season could last for a few months, dances interfered with the policy of promoting agricultural activities and private property. Certain dances were specifically targeted, particularly the sun dance and the ghost dance, the latter for its messianic element. The massacre of 300 Sioux at Wounded Knee Creek in December 1890 marked a tragic and terrible moment in U.S. history, as well as the close of the frontier and the effective end of the ghost dance movement. Missionary complaints about Pueblo dances blossomed after the Indian Rights Association observed the Hopi snake dance in 1913, which triggered an effort to accumulate condemnable accounts of such dances over the next decade. Such accounts emphasized and exaggerated lurid aspects of Pueblo dances, and they led to a ban on dances in primitive and pagan conditions. While implementation of the ban favored educational processes, punitive measures were allowed. In 1923, limitations on the time and duration of the dances were issued, but these triggered surprisingly strong responses by members of the public concerned about religious liberty and among government ethnologists who knew the ceremonies had been misrepresented. In a number of cases, reports by sympathetic agents supporting the dances allowed those dances to continue. As we'll see in a future lecture, this conflict between ethnologists on the one hand and Indian agents and military leaders on the other extended to peyote use as well. The formal suppression of tribal religious and ceremonial life ended when John Collier became Indian Commissioner at the outset of the Indian Reorganization era. Commissioner Collier promoted the revitalization of tribal culture and religious practice. In 1934, the BIA declared, "No interference with Indian religious life or ceremonial expression will hereafter be tolerated." In our next lecture, we will complete our unit on the cultural and legal landscapes by surveying First Amendment jurisprudence and legislation generally.